Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Jonathan Silvertown, author of Selfish Genes to Social Beings, A Cooperative History of Life, published by Oxford and released earlier this year. At the Institute of Evolutionary Biology, Jonathan was the Professor of Evolutionary Ecology and the Chair in Technology Enhanced Science Education at Edinburgh. His previous works include The Comedy of Error, Dinner with Darwin, The Long and the Short of It, An Orchard Invisible, Demons in Eden. He edited 99% Ape, and he wrote The Fragile Web. One of the reasons I list them all is I want to talk about the covers because the covers are really good. And as a bookseller, that's really important for me to come from behind the counter and hand sell them. And I would also recommend his many YouTube videos, of which this will be one. So cooperation, the idea of working together towards the same end. And without it, as Jonathan boldly and succinctly says, without it, there would be no life, not life as we know it, but no life at all. So why? The ability to replicate, prime directive. And in order to do so, you have to have two, even if they're kind of the same thing. One is the blueprint, and the other is the catalyzer, the stimulator, the accelerant. So on his way to the more complicated and evolutionary travels through cooperative action, Jonathan starts us off with groups, then individuals, cells, concluding with genes. So with examples as disparate as the Mexican earthquake, to the extinction of the bison, to the World War I Christmas truce, we move on to subjects seemingly as unconnected as pirates and lichen, and one of my favorites, the bobtail squid. And we're taught to realize that we might be in a prisoner's dilemma world, a possible zero-sum game, or instead a world that exists because we figuratively shake hands, sometimes with crossed fingers behind our back, sometimes with the noblest of intentions. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
So, as I said before we started, as a bookseller, could start it this way. One of the things I've noticed about the books I mentioned is they all have really, really good, colorful covers. And I was wondering whether you designed them, whether you vetted them, how they came about. Because as a bookseller, the old adage is you don't judge by a book by its cover. Every single person who comes into my bookstore does exactly that.
Well, yes, I know it's one of those jokes, isn't it? Don't judge a book by its cover, and as you say, everybody does. I can't say that I contribute to the designs at all, except by a process of rejection. So I have rejected a few appalling covers in my time, but the one for Selfish Genes to Social Beings, the current book, was produced by Oxford University Press, their own designer, I think, and I instantly liked it. I thought it was really good, and that's true actually of my previous book, which was really witty cover, which your readers will have to have a look at to find it. Picture it, maybe on your website or somewhere, or my website actually. A really witty cover, and they just the publishers produced that sort of spontaneously. I thought, wow, this is great. So yeah, sometimes you're lucky. With Dinner with Darwin, the original cover that was published by Chicago University Press, and the original cover was really, I mean, weird. It was a brown leaf or something strange, I seem to remember. I mean, unrelated to the subject of the book and not very attractive. So I simply said, surely you can do better than this. And they came up, I think it was the same artist, actually, same designer, came up with this stunning cover. I've actually had somebody come up to me at a book festival where I was holding this book, somebody who didn't know who I was, and said, where can I buy that book? And they didn't want to know what it was about or anything. They just wanted to cut the book because of the cover. Yeah, it's a bit dispiriting for an author in a way, isn't it? I mean, never mind what's inside. Let's just have a nice cover.
Well, the idea also, there's a certain continuity, which is really good, because if you look at the book the second time or the third book, you kind of see the continuity, which really helps a lot. Anyway, All right, I'm going to jump all over the place because there's just so much stuff to cover and we can't possibly cover all of it. So let's talk about why Sigmund Freud is a eukaryote,
Eukaryote.
and why, who else is? Because that's a
Well,
good way to start, I think.
okay. Well, some, maybe many of your readers will know eukaryotes are basically organisms with complex cells that contain mitochondria, and which go through a reduction division called meiosis. All that's the biological jargon, but basically anything with more than one cell. So most definitely us and pretty much everything we can see and would see in ordinary life. Those are all eukaryotes, and the other lot are the prokaryotes, and they have one cell. So bacteria, for example, there are some one-celled eukaryotes, but the transition between eukaryotes, well, the evolution of eukaryotes, which came after the evolution of prokaryotes, was a major transition in evolution. And that sounds like, oh, it's just a major transition, but actually in evolutionary jargon, the term major transition in evolution has acquired a particular meaning. And what it refers to is basically when you go from two separate organisms, which are perhaps working together, to a team of organisms. So the eukaryotes were formed by the union of two kinds of prokaryote, a bacterium and a thing called an archaeon. And one of those was the mitochondrion, was the ancestor of the mitochondrion. So this little sort of battery that we have in all our cells, and thousands of these things that produce the energy that runs our cells and all of life, all of more complex life, was originally a free-living bacterium. And so when they joined up, I'm not sure what the latest date is, it's reckoned to be somewhere around 1.8 billion years ago. Somebody will tell me I've got that a bit wrong. These dates generally get pushed further and further back as more and more studies come up. Anyway, a long time ago, that produced this new group of organisms, the eukaryotes, to which we belong.
Well, so you mentioned billions, you use billions, not as much as Carl Sagan, but, and you talk about, and like I said, I'm jumping around the bobtail squid, and I go, okay, billions of years, but you compare the bobtail to an Indiana Jones movie, and the idea of so many, when you read what you're written, there's so many things those bioluminescent bacteria have to do to get in there, and then you slough them off at night and you start over again.
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's so amazing that if I was less intelligent, I would think of it has to be intelligent design. It's almost inconceivable, even given 1 billion years, that Darwin was right and that somehow natural selection decided, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to do this, and this.
Well, I mean, I said that the production of my book covers was a process, a random process of rejection. I reject the ones I don't like and I end up with the ones I like. Well, I mean, natural selection kind of works that way as well. There's a whole heap of errors happens. Mutations is what we tend to call them. And some of them actually just happen to make things better, and those then get selected through natural selection. And generally speaking, evolution operates very gradually, which means quite slowly. But at these things called major transitions, you can get huge jumps very quickly. And this is something that I think evolutionary biologists in the past have not really paid enough attention to, because of the well, starting with Darwin, the first job he had to do was expand people's minds about how long life had been on Earth, or how long evolution had to play with. Because, if it's a gradual process operating by a process of tinkering, as Dawkins would call it, it's going to take a long time. And around the time of Darwin, the theological view was that the Earth was 4,600 years old, created on a Sunday afternoon. I mean, somebody did actually. I don't know. I added the Sunday afternoon bit, but somebody did actually use the Bible to calculate the likely date of the creation, and it was, you know, it was thousands of years ago, before their time at that moment. And so Darwin and others, and actually others came before him, basically said they looked at the rocks, they looked at geology, and they said, well, hell, you know, the Earth has got to be older than that. It's just got to be. And that was a really important step before evolution could be accepted, really, that there would have that our concept of the age of the Earth would have to be expanded so that there was time for evolution as a gradual process to happen. And now we know that very occasionally extraordinary things happen very quickly. So when the bacterium that was the ancestor of the mitochondria got together with the archaeon and to form the eukaryote cell, I don't know how long that took, but it was a relatively quick event, and evolution came up with something entirely new that was the foundation of everything we see around us today. Eukaryotes, in other words, and that was quick. That was quick, and I think that process. So I describe that as when you start off with a team of two or more players, and then they start to reproduce as a unit. So that's actually what happens in our cells, in eukaryote cells. When a eukaryote cell divides, the mitochondria are transmitted along with the nucleus of the cell. So they formed a kind of a permanent union that goes across generations, one generation to the next. So I'm leaping all over the place here, but so I'll stop there.
Well, and what I should have done, because the book is kind of a deductive reasoning book, you start out with what, you know, but wait a minute, why is this important? You start out with in Seriatim, Mexico City, then you talk about the prisoner's dilemma, zero-sum games, World War I, and the Christmas truce. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about each and why you decided, okay, I'm going to start out with groups and demonstrate why this is cooperation and why sometimes cooperation is this and sometimes cooperation is that.
Right. Okay. Well, let me start with the book is written backwards, so to speak. I mean, most books about evolution. This is the subtitle of this book is A Cooperative History of Life. So most histories start way back and end up at the present. I start at the present and end up at the origin of life. And the reason I did it that way round is because I thought it would be easier to understand and to establish the principles of cooperation, which apply extraordinarily. They apply at the level of groups of humans and groups of animals and so on, right the way in cells, right the way back down to the origin of life. And you started off by talking about, you know, how cooperation was important at the origin of life, because you have to have molecules that do these two things. There's a catalyst and there's a kind of template, and the two things have to work together. That's cooperation at an extremely primitive level. The rules of that, the basic rules of that, and the basic rules of anything we do as cooperative beings are the same. And we can come to what they are in a moment. So I thought, well, if you're talking about this, it's going to be a lot easier to enter with what people are familiar with, which is, you know, how we are interacting in groups, how animals and plants interact in groups, and then to work down. So the first section of the book is about groups, and then it's about individuals, and then it's cells, and then it's genes. And yeah, so
well, one of the things I did when going down, which I hate the expression, rabbit hole, is when you talked about the Christmas truce in World War I, I watched some of the YouTube videos, some of the actual footage, and the coolest idea in that story you tell us that the war could have been over. No one wanted, these guys didn't want to fight it. They didn't even understand why they were 50 feet apart. And then the generals came in.
Yeah.
So tell about why, how that happened,
Well,
what happened, and why it didn't work.
well, I mean, there are current examples of this if you think about
Yeah, I
the
know.
war, well, probably any of the wars that are going on at the moment. I mean, the guys who were dying in the front line would probably rather like to kind of come to a little agreement and stop fighting, but they're impelled by powers that control them from behind usually. And this is what happened in the First World War, is that so for those people who don't know about it, it's quite a famous situation, the Christmas truce of 1914. So apparently what people were saying about the First World War is all be over by Christmas. Christmas 1914, that would have been, and that was actually, the first of 5 years of war, in which there was huge carnage, huge carnage. The Allied soldiers and the German soldiers faced each other across no man's land that was only a few hundred yards wide in places, and they were dug into trenches, and they could hear each other. They could actually speak to each other across that distance. They would occasionally be told to get over the top and raid each other's trenches and all that kind of stuff. And in the Christmas 1914, on the Western Front, the soldiers got out of their trenches. They shouted to each other, "I won't shoot if you don't shoot," and they got out of the trenches and they had a party and a football match in no man's land. And this just didn't happen in one place, but it happened apparently in many places all the way along the Western Front. And this was reported, and there are some nice, I don't know if there are any photographs, but there are certainly nice drawings from Illustrated London News, things like that of that time, showing the Germans in their pointy helmets and the Brits in their flat caps, sort of fraternizing, sharing schnapps and whiskey and basic cigars and all this kind of stuff. And 24 hours later, they were killing each other again. And there's a wonderful book about actually the relationship between what happened in trench warfare in that time. And it says that actually, although there was never a truce like that again, and that truce was sort of more or less sanctioned by the generals, they kind of went, "Oh, that's Christmas, okay." But immediately afterwards, it was back to murder business as usual. And nonetheless, soldiers would come to sort of temporary truces along the line. They would lob messages over to each other that said at 4 o'clock. So I'm just going to turn my outlook off. They would send messages to each other and say at 4 o'clock we have to send over a bomb because the captain says so, but we're going to give you warning, so take cover and don't you fire back, but we're not trying to kill you, so don't try and kill us. And that happened all the time. And when the generals who were further back, they were behind the front lines, and they were in charge of the artillery. And of course, the guys operating the artillery were not in earshot of each other. They couldn't talk to each other, and so they were told to fire. And so that then stopped these cooperative arrangements that happened between the guys in the opposing trenches, because people behind the lines essentially broke it up. And that illustrates some of the important principles of cooperation. The first one is that cooperation is generally self-interested. And there are many, many situations in which cooperation occurs because it's to the advantage of both parties. Okay, so nobody's doing anybody else a favor. It's to the advantage of both sides to cooperate. And it was clearly to the advantage of both sides in the trenches to not kill each other. I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? But the guys further back thought that one more push and, it'll all be mine, and all that kind of stuff. And so they perceive the advantages differently, and of course they weren't paying the price either. It was other people were dying. So anyway, we won't get into all that, but the key principle is that cooperation is generally self-interested, but it works. So you might think if it has to be self-interested all the time, there aren't going to be any situations where that's the truth, where that happens. In fact, it is. That's the extraordinary thing. And the other thing about cooperation, which again applies right away from the kind of situation we're talking about, right down to cells and molecules, is there has to be some mechanism to stop cheats, to stop people breaking up the cooperation, right? So you have, when you make a truce, you have to have some way of saying, well, if you break this truce, it's going to be really bad. You're not just going to get shot at. We're going to get bringing in the, we're going to shoot at you twice as bad, or whatever it might be. So there has to be some way of controlling cheating. These two principles can be found in all sorts of, worked out in all sorts of different weird ways often, throughout nature.
Well, you know what, that gets us to the prisoner's dilemma, and the chart I have is the chart I always see. It's 4 lines, attack, attack, attack. Explain how that is not necessarily a zero-sum game. It's something else, not like chess where someone wins and someone loses.
Right. So the prisoner's dilemma is basically the idea that, there are rewards for cooperation, but you don't trust the other side. So better attack them before they attack you. That's basically what it is. That's the dilemma. So you realize that cooperation would be would be advantageous to both of you, but can you risk it, right? Because if you decide to cooperate and the other side decides to attack, then you lose. Now, if you play this game, and it's called a game mathematically, but it's not a game in the sense of being trivial or frivolous. It's a game in the sense of what I do depends on what you do, and the payoff for what I do depends on what you do. And that's the sort of definition of a game in this sense. And it turns out that this changes if you play repeatedly, right? So if you play once, then the dilemma, it always ends up with no cooperation, because the only safe thing to do is to attack first. But if it's a repeated game, you can actually evolve to a situation where you say, well, I won't attack if you don't attack, right? And so what was required for that is some sort of cooperation, to get cooperation out of this, what's called an iterated prisoner's dilemma, is that you play the game over and over, and that people are able to learn what the rules are.
There's an interesting corollary in America. There's this convenience store where you can buy things, use the ATM machine, get sandwiches, get your gas, and it has the unfortunate name of Wawa. It's a chain of convenience stores. And for some reason, they did a double door airlock situation where they don't have to do the double door. But what happens in the morning when you go in to get coffee, you open the door for someone and they say thank you, or they open the door for you and you say thank you. You acknowledge their existence, they acknowledge yours. You both realize you're part of humanity. You walk in and you're happy, you tend to consume more. And Wawa has changed this, so that situation occurs. And I thought, well, is that cooperation?
Wow. Okay.
Does it evolve? Does it, it's capitalism from Wawa's part, but I know that I feel better when I open the door and someone thanks me. And when they open the door and I thank them, I feel better about myself. They feel better about me.
Yeah. Well, we are a very cooperative species, and we like helping each other. And the very act of helping somebody gives you, most people, a sense of pleasure. So of course, if you're designing a store and you understand this kind of thing, along with where the positioning of staff, putting things at eye level, putting things at the till, all that kind of stuff, this is just another one of those.
Well, what's the point? Where does that take us? It's just, we feel good. We are a cooperative species. But how does that tie into Erasmus or Charles Darwin?
Sorry, say that again. I don't know quite get
it. Okay, we cooperate. We feel good. We're part of humanity. We're people. It's good. but where does it take us in terms of the evolutionary process?
Oh, okay. So how do we? Oh, or to put it another way, you mean? I mean, how did we get this way? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. How do we get this?
How do we get this way? Yeah. So that's a major question, and one of the motivations of my book, because a naive idea, interpretation of evolution. I mean, I want to say naive. I don't necessarily mean not a good one. I mean, it's a reasonable question to ask. Is evolution favors the individuals who leave the most offspring in the next generation, transmit their genes. So why isn't this just a world full of people who are out for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you have to go back in history a little bit and ask basically what do you need to do to successfully raise offspring. And we happen to be a species in which it's impossible to raise children on your own. I mean, anybody who's trying to do this knows this fact. It takes the African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a village to help you, that's great. But I mean, it's basically, we have a long childhood, we have to learn a lot, and successfully raising children does require cooperation. So that's number one. So that's really important. And I think another one is that in our hunter-gatherer past, which isn't that long ago, we were small apes hunting big animals. So Homo erectus 1.8 million years ago, there are fossil anthropologists discovered fossil camps where there are bones of this species that was an ancestor of ours, or a cousin of an ancestor of ours, Homo erectus, and apparently, wherever you find these camps, you find elephant bones, and it appears that Homo erectus' favorite food, so far as the fossils go, was elephant. Now, I mean, how do small creatures like us, relatively speaking, compared to an elephant, kill an elephant? Well, we have to cooperate and have tools, of course. But these sort of factors in our evolution, particularly the need to help each other raise children, I think, made us a very cooperative species. And I think that's kind of how I understand it.
Let me give you another example from my experience. And this is a much simpler one, still involving a group of sorts. So when I was building houses in Florida, we had a job we were doing where there was this endangered species called a gopher tortoise. And they wanted us to remediate, even by building loose PVC tubes under the road so the gopher tortoises could migrate. Somehow we got out of that. I didn't want to do that. But in every gopher tortoise hole, there was also a rattlesnake. The idea is the gopher tortoise made a nice place for the rattlesnake to live, and the rattlesnake protected the gopher tortoise from predators. That's a really simple one. But unlike humans, they didn't sit there and play cards, and they didn't say, oh, this is really nice that we have this set up this way. But somehow that must have happened once, and therefore that tortoise and the rattlesnake were able to have young because they were better suited to the environment and their ecological niche.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to me, that's a kind of basic cooperative endeavor. Mm-hmm. And what I did through the rest of the book, when, like I said, it was deductive, I was trying to equate that simple arrangement to the arrangement of the smallest of the creatures you discuss. And is it basically the same thing?
Well, basically yes, but it's somewhat different when you're talking about cooperation within a species and cooperation between species. And one of the most important things about so I like to again, I said reason to start at the group groups is because actually very often when we're talking about cooperation, we're talking about members of a team. So I like to think of a team sport, for example. And there are two things that make cooperation in a team work. One is the force of numbers. So it's better to have a team of 11 or 15 than it is to have a team of 2. And the other is division of labor. So I'm sorry to say I don't understand most American sports, but so I'll have to use the ones I know about. So soccer, you don't put everybody in the goal, right? You allow one person in the goal, and then you have some people in defense, and you have some people who are strikers, and they go and score goals at the other end of the pitch and whatever, right? If everybody's doing the same thing, you won't score. So the kind of joke is, if you had 11 goalies, 11 people in goal on either side, the highest score you could get would be 0-0. Okay. But division of labor mean, so that somebody keeps goal and the other people do other things, means you get a high score. So that's actually a nice, and that's not just a metaphor. It's actually it's a good example of cooperation and how it works. You've got division of labor, you've got the force of numbers. So you can see that playing out within species quite frequently. So what I just mentioned about raising a child, raising a family, right? It's easier to share these responsibilities with another family. But you wouldn't do that with another species, or at least it would be a lot harder to organize, right? But what happens with other species is that you do get divisions of labor, because different species occupy different niches, they do different things, and that then gives you enormous possible advantage through cooperation. Because in the example you described with the rattlesnake and the gopher tortoise, one of them digs a hole, the other one defends it. Now, I guess, the gopher tortoise isn't very good at defending, and the rattlesnake probably isn't very good at digging. These are very different animals, and they have, if you like, different talents, different niches, and so often in nature you find cooperation, or symbiosis, as we often, basically biological term for this is symbiosis, between things that are extraordinarily different. They're in different kingdoms, between a plant and an animal, between a fungus and a plant, between yeah. So that's actually quite common because they are different, and that of course means they're different species.
Well, the obverse of that, and I found the most poignant part of the book, is the extinction of the bison, because the quote you give from the Native American, and I've forgotten what his name was, is he gave a litany of what each part of the bison was used for by the Native Americans. Were very efficient people. They were very smart. They had to figure out how to do all the things they did, whether it was making bows and arrows or protecting themselves from the elements. And that's the obverse, I there was exactly the opposite, which made
I mean, there was cooperation among people. So I mean, these bison jumps where bison were driven over a cliff and fell to their death in huge numbers. I mean, thousands of Native Americans would cooperate. They would come together from far and wide to these landscapes where they could channel bison over miles, till they reached a point where they were driven in panic over a cliff, and then they would die. And then
I was talking about the parasitic. I could have taken this wrong. I see which I.
Yeah, sorry. So you're talking about the relationship between bison and people, right?
Yeah, the white man destroying what allowed.
Well, I mean, we have it apparently sort of verbatim from the mouths and records of settlers in the West, that they got rid of the bison in order to get rid of the Native Americans. I mean, that was one way in which, to deprive them of their livelihood, deprive them of their means of subsistence.
Yeah, you give a quote about every bison killed is one less Indian. You put it there.
Well, I quote that. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm trying to think. Okay, one, why did you put that quote in there because it does show directly how we tend to, the white man cooperates in order to eliminate what it considers a threat. It's cooperation
Well,
on.
so my book's about cooperation, and cooperation is extremely widespread, but I at no point deny that there are uncooperative situations as well. Of course, I mean, it would be madness to ignore that. But it is extraordinary how, in the most adverse circumstances, such as First World War trenches, you can get cooperation when, in the midst of a battle, right?
Yeah,
Now,
what I was going to say was we are cooperating intensively
yes,
to extinguish the human race. There's an enormous amount of cooperation towards eliminating one species that is destroying the planet's ecology.
well, I'm not sure we're doing it deliberately.
Oh,
I mean, some people might, but I think by and large, we're doing it selfishly. Okay, that's for sure.
the selfish
And
gene.
people are doing it. Well,
Dawkins, selfish gene. It's exactly the same.
no, but actually, I mean, it's a very good point that that actually this is madness. I mean, we know this is not a good plan. And as I said earlier, there are these two things that you have to take into account. There's the advantages of cooperation, but you also have to defend against cheating. And I think you can describe a large number of the damaging consequences of human cooperation as people cheating, right? So there's this whole idea of the tragedy of the commons. So this goes back. This is essentially the idea that if you have something that is shared between all and nobody, then what will happen is that everybody will try and take as much of this common pool resource as they can. So if it's grazing land, for example, everybody will pile the sheep or the cattle onto the land in order to extract as much value from it as they can, because they'd rather have it than somebody else do it. And that leads to disaster, the tragedy of the commons. Okay, and we know there are situations like this. Fisheries are a very good example of this. Global fisheries, those outside territorial waters.
Yeah.
But if you look at how people share commons, if you like, in the best of circumstances, and we can talk about what that means in a moment, but generally speaking, people arrange to cooperate to prevent disaster. So generally speaking, commons are regulated by the people who use them so that their children and their children's children will still be able to actually raise cattle and cut down trees or whatever it is, and that they won't be exhausting those resources all in one go. So we're now in a situation where we need global cooperation to protect the climate, which is the ultimate example of a commons. It's a global commons. Now, it's extremely difficult to organize cooperation on that scale. It's not really ever been done. I mean, the thing that everybody quotes is the Kyoto Protocol that protected the ozone layer by stopping people producing CFCs. That was a relatively easy one. It was one or two chemicals that had substitutes that weren't damaging, and it was, but I mean, we're having huge difficulty in cutting back on the causes of climate change for all sorts of reasons. And by and large, it's just going to be really hard not to use not to drive to work if there isn't an alternative, and if there, or to turn down the air conditioning, or turn down if you live in Scotland like I do, turn down the heating. It's not something you really want to do, and yeah, maybe we need to do this. Well, actually, what we need to do is insulate our houses better. But there are solutions, but they're not so easy. So I'm not painting a kind of rosy picture that everything, because cooperation occurs everywhere, it's easy or it's going to happen.
Well, well,
Um,
let's switch the example from something that's kind of terrible that maybe I shouldn't have even brought up, but you spent some time talking about dogs and cats. And so
mhm, mhm.
as for a layman, the beginning of the book is like it's entertaining and easy, but as you delve into it, and not to say to anybody that it's not accessible, because it is, and it's also an excellent learning process. But you once we go away from that, it's not something we're generally intimately familiar with. But why do you talk about dogs and cats and domestication? And how does that lead to an evolutionary process that's beneficial for us and them?
Well, domestication is sort of, it's not really cooperation in the sense we've been talking about up till now.
No.
In that, you know, we have, I mean, cats are not as fully domesticated as dogs are, and one question is why not? Well, part of it is that actually dogs have been domesticated for longer. They're probably the first animal we domesticated maybe 30,000 years ago. And they're highly social and they live in packs, so they kind of lend themselves to, you know, the kind of cooperative behavior that cats are less easy to persuade for. But basically what we've done is we've selected the tamest animals each generation, the ones that don't bite your hand or will scratch you, to breed from. I mean, and it may have been unconscious initially. And some people think that actually some of these animals, dogs in particular, kind of domesticated themselves because they became camp followers. They would hang around the camp and they'd eat the scraps. And, you know, the more tame they were, the more food they got. And people then started to say, oh, that's, you know, the reaction to animals is, if they're not dangerous, to either to eat them or to pet them, I guess, or maybe both. So so you can see how this would have evolved, but it's not quite the same process of cooperation that we were talking about up to now, because
Well,
it does involve us shaping another species genetically in order to suit our ends, and this is particularly true of other domesticated species.
well, as we move down or backwards,
Mhm.
um, and still dealing with stuff that the layperson is definitely familiar with, I'm looking at it right now at my window
Right.
at trees,
Yeah.
is lichen and algae and fungi.
Mm.
We know what they are, but what you do is explicate how they aren't just one.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
so talk about how that triad, if you will, factors in so closely.
Yeah. So we mentioned symbiosis a
Right.
little earlier, which is this living together. Literally, it's living together. Symbiosis, living together, of species that are generally very different from each other, biologically. And the first example really to be recognized, close symbiosis anyway, was when it was discovered that lichens, these things, or lichens, however you like to pronounce it, that live on trees and roofs and walls and stones, and you know, and they're everywhere once you look, and you can see some out your window, are actually not a single organism as people thought. They're actually a fungus, generally on the outside, and an alga, or sometimes a blue-green bacterium, on the inside. And most recently, people have discovered that there are other things in there as well. In fact, I was talking to my ecologist the other day, and he was saying there are up to 15 different organisms inside these things. Now, some of them may be like the rattlesnake inside the gopher hole, the gopher tortoise hole, and that they just take up residence. You know, they're there by you know, coincidence, by happenstance. But others might actually be doing something quite important. And there are single-celled yeasts inside lichens, apparently. And the extraordinary thing is that although we've known for like 200 years that lichens are composed of these two principal organisms, an alga and a fungus, nobody's yet managed to take a separate fungus and alga and put them together and to create a lichen. Um, You'd have thought that would have been kind of, you know, something you could do, but not yet. I mean, I'm sure sooner or later somebody will do it, but So how do we get down this line
Well, it was,
conversation?
I'm trying to move from what we know intimately, and it
Yeah.
goes perfectly, is like when you say yeast is a one cell organism, and I think
Yes.
that people think that's impossible because what you're talking about, there has to be someone has to replicate to keep things going. So that leads to mitochondria to me, and DNA, and
Mm.
and we haven't gotten to chloroplast yet, but and also mitochondria is cool because you also talk about the scholarly argument about what mitochondria is. So maybe we should move now. Okay, how does a fungus work?
How
If
does
it's
fungus work? Okay, so the thing about fungi is that they so plants get their energy from sunlight. We get our energy from plants ultimately. I mean, animals eat plants, but ultimately, fungi live mainly by decomposing other things. They rot other things. Or they rob other things. I mean, you could say it's not unlike us eating a bowl of salad if you want, a fungus feeding on algae, but they're unable to obtain energy directly from sunlight or anything in the chlorophyll. So they invariably either they're disease organisms, or they are many of them, many fungi, or they are they live on rotting things. I mean, they're important ecologically because if there were no fungi, then leaves wouldn't rot down. Bodies would lie around the place without decomposing, etc., etc. So fungi are really important in the sort of grand scheme of life and circling nutrients and so on. But as a group, as a kingdom, they are exclusively rotters.
well, take yeast then.
Mm.
Basically, what I'm asking you to do is tell us as the reader what's inside of these things that
Okay.
are
So what's really interesting is that yeast, the definition of a yeast is it's a single-celled fungus. Now, the kind of fungi that we're, like the mushrooms you might buy in the store or whatever, those are multicellular. They've got lots of cells you look under a microscope. But the yeast in your beer, or the yeast that you use to make your bread, or is used to make bread, those are single-celled. And they have mostly evolved from multicellular fungi. It's fascinating. They've actually gone backwards. They've given up the sort of multicellular existence, which we think is so great. I'm talking slightly tongue-in-cheek here, and become single-celled. Why? Well, actually, single-cell status has a lot going for it from an evolutionary point of view. Number one is that you can reproduce very quickly. You're one cell, you just divide. You don't have to find a mate. You don't have to distinguish between males, females, or different mating types, or whatever. You simply divide in two, and then those two divide in two, and so on. And that's a huge advantage. Also, you can live inside your food. So this is obviously what the yeast in a ferment are doing, in a beer vat. They're basically living inside a liquid medium that gives them everything they need until it runs out, of course, which it does. So and the fermentation ends, and you have a bottle of wine or a bottle of beer or whatever. So yeah, there are huge advantages to being a single-celled organism, and in some groups, they've actually evolved
yeah, but
from multicellular organisms.
you talk about if you're talking about quantum physics, for example, and you talk about an electron,
Mhm.
that's it. That's you've gone down as far as you can go. It's turtles all the way down, but what as it's not. So what I'm trying to paint you into a corner with is what actually is inside this single cell.
I
Is
see. What you mean? What's the minimum thing? What's the minimum reproductive unit
yeah,
you can have?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is the kind of, the elementary biology, and what is a living thing? I mean, that's what you're asking. What is a living thing? And a living thing, well, I've got two or three books up here called What is Life? So people do write entire books on it. But basically, if you look at a standard biology textbook, it will say that it's something that can reproduce itself. It's irritable, so it's sensitive to the environment, it reacts to the environment, and it can evolve. Richard Dawkins would say, actually, the evolution bit is the most important. Anything that can, if it can evolve, it's alive, and if it can't evolve, it's not alive. So that's one way of looking at it. So what is the minimum that can evolve? Well, at the origin of life, it was probably single chains of nucleotides, just tiny bits of maybe RNA.
So that if you go back to, and this is kind of winding down, and as we conclude, then what I would ask you is this: the last thing you say in the coda of your book, and then further reading, which I would highly suggest, is that, as we talked at the beginning, without cooperation, there would not be life. So let's go back to what is hackneyed phrase, the primordial soup. And so you have a primordial soup, and then maybe there's a strike of lightning or something.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in the primordial soup? I mean, it's contested, but what happened in the primordial soup that led to the first thing that led to cooperation? But you're saying the chicken and an egg, you're saying the prime mover is cooperation. What was cooperating in the primordial?
Okay. So our current best guess, and I guess some people would argue with this, but some biologists might argue with this. Obviously, creationists will have a whole other kind of argument. But our current best guess, from a scientific point of view, is this theory called the RNA world. And so RNA is basically, if you think of DNA being two strands wound together like a famous double helix, RNA is a single, a slightly different chemical composition, but essentially one strand. And there's good reason to suppose that RNA came before DNA. DNA is more stable, and it was probably a later evolutionary, but very early evolutionary development. And the kind of things that people are doing now is trying to find ways in which you can take a lab soup of RNA molecules, very short ones, and get these things to evolve in such a way that they cross the barrier between chemistry and biology, between non-life and life. And considerable progress has been made. Considerable progress. We're not there yet, but it'll happen. It'll happen.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So the quick answer to your question is on RNA, the RNA molecule. And of course I talk about this in the book, but RNA world, if anybody wants to follow this up, the key term, search term is RNA world, and you will find lots of discussion about this. And there's debate about whether this all happened in hydrothermal vents in the deep sea, or whether actually it had to happen somewhere near the surface. And I kind of rather like the idea it happened near the surface.
Well, I could even go further down, like where the RNA came from, but I'm not going to do that. What I was going to do was talk about how on your website you say, and it's kind of cool, that you always have been writing. And so what I was going to ask you last was, so each of your books, and it's such a panoply of different subjects, from sense of humor to this. And so each book, I would assume, as a bookseller again, you want the reader to take something away from it. Obviously, it's comprehensive, but you also want some specific thing. So I would ask, what would you like, especially because, as I said, the book starts out, things we know, and then things you're teaching us to the very end. And then here's your message in the coda. So what would you like my readers to take away from this book, if you will?
I think the fact that there are some simple rules that make cooperation happen, and that defend cooperation against cheating, which is always there, and that these rules actually are universal. So, you know, you may not be interested in the origin of life. You may only be interested in team sports. The rules are the same fundamentally.
Right.
That's extraordinary to me. And I mean, I guess, you know, if people go, wow, I'm happy.
Yeah, and that's how I feel about doing what I do. And the idea of someone picking up a book, whether it's the one they came in to buy or whether they just see your cover and buy it and then they're surprised and delighted. So thanks so much, Jonathan. The book is
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the book is Selfish Genes to Social Beings, A Cooperative History of Life. It's in our store. And I've asked my manager book procurer to get a copy of each of your previous books so that I can lead them to them. So thanks again,
Terrific.
Jonathan. So, okay, last, I always say it's last and it's not. So since you always write, what's next?
Leaves. It's a book currently called Nature's Magicians, How Leaves Conjured Up Our World. And my agent is sending it out to publishers as we speak, he tells me. And basically, I'm looking out of my window and I'm seeing a tree, which is essentially a stick with leaves attached. I mean, obviously, it's slightly more than that, but, you know, everybody kind of pays lots of attention to the tree and rather little attention to the leaves, but it's the leaves that are doing all the work, and leaves are just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the reason I've chosen the title I mentioned, which is Nature's Magicians, is because I kind of think that if people really knew what trees and well, sorry, not tree, what leaves do, they would think these are magic. You know, if a person could do these things, it would be a magic trick. It would be if you could raise water 100 meters into the air silently using nothing but the power of sunlight all day long. People would go, wow, that's amazing. How do you do that? That's going on all around us. Nobody pays any attention whatsoever. So that's kind of the conceit of the book. And yeah, hopefully that's enough to whet people's appetites. It will be out in about 18 months. I've not finished writing it yet.
Oh, hopefully we can talk again.
That will be wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks
I
so
look
much,
forward to that. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.